Zeus and Aphrodite have a brother, Poseidon. The Romans called him Neptune. He's the god of sea and earthquakes. Homer calls him the earth thrower. And there you see his symbol, the trident, that three-pointed spear that he's got there. Sea gods are interesting as examples of this move from animistic to anthropomorphic visions of the gods. I've got the three generations of the major sea gods on the screen there. Excuse me. There's Pontus, who's created by Gaia, or just kind of arises out of Gaia. There's Oceanus, the second generation, who's a Titan. Both of these are animistic gods. Pontus means sea, and Oceanus means ocean. Again, it's like clock, right? Ocean. The god is ocean. There's not very many stories about Pontus and Oceanus, but then Poseidon in the third generation, the Olympian generation, is full-bore anthropomorphic. I mean, everything bad about human beings shows up with Poseidon. And Poseidon's a very powerful god. We learned that recently, right? Water's pretty powerful. I had a neighbor whose truck got washed away and all kinds of damage done by the flooding. You've probably seen the surf come up during high tide and take away all the sand castles and stuff and leave the sand all nice and smooth, destroying roads or whatever. Well, water's very powerful. Have you ever tried to follow a drop of water like down a windshield? It goes this way and that way, so it's kind of water's kind of tricky, kind of devious. It's always twisting and turning. And sea gods tend to be like that. Or they tend to be very big and powerful because there's a lot of water. How much of the Earth's surface is covered by water? I forget. 75%? That's a lot. There's a lot of water around here. So that makes it very powerful. So the sea gods, you see, they had to be very studly, and the sea goddesses had to be very fertile because there's an awful lot of water out there for them to populate. Oceanus, that second generation Titan, has like millions and millions and millions of kids with his wife Tethys. But they're animistic, okay? And no one thinks that's a problem. No one suggests they might want to slow things down a bit. Nobody wonders how they're going to care for all these kids. Nobody even asks these kind of questions because there's so much water. You got to have all these kids to fill it. By the third generation, these sea gods kind of slow down. There's one sea god in that third generation, Doris, come from the same place at Pandora. Doris means the gifted one. She only has 50 kids, which is still an awful lot, but because there's an awful lot of power. When we're talking about animistic gods at the start of time, they're like pushing out kids all over the place. By the third generation, it kind of slows down. And because it's anthropomorphic, you have more gods to make up stories about. You don't hold Oceanus to, responsible parenting. But Poseidon, you're kind of concerned about where the kids are going to come up. So you got the sea gods who are notoriously studly and the sea goddesses who are notoriously fertile. And Poseidon has the same approach to marriage that Zeus does, which is not much of one. He marries one of the sea goddesses, Aphrodite. She develops kind of a nasty personality from being cheated on all the time. Can't say I blame her all that much, really, when you think about it. But you have to understand there's more than just the moral point going on here. If you're going to have sea gods, you have to have all kinds of procreation. You have to have all kinds of children because you have all kinds of water to fill up with the gods. And being married to Poseidon isn't much of a picnic because most of his gods are kind of weird. You have to picture Poseidon sitting in his office with pictures of his kids on the wall around him and on his desk. There's no picture of Aphrodite because he's not really all that into being married. He's got only one legitimate son by Aphrodite. That's his son Triton. Triton, we would call a merman. He's half fish and half man, the fish being the bottom part. He has a big horn that he blows to announce the coming of Poseidon. If you see very many fountains around the world, he's a big figure in fountains. Another child of Poseidon's he's very proud of is Arion. Arion is a horse. Where Arion comes from is kind of interesting. One day Poseidon gets the hots for his sister, Demeter. Like I said, there's a lot of shallow gene pool stuff going on here. Demeter is out in the field one day, and Demeter, we'll get to her in a minute, is the grain god, the goddess of fertility. And so she's out in the field checking on flowers and plants and that kind of stuff when she sees Poseidon walking towards her, and she gets kind of a creepy feeling, and she turns herself into a mare, a horse, and gallops away as fast as she can. Well, Poseidon turns himself into a stallion and gallops after her as far as he can, and then he catches her, and the child who's conceived there is Arion. And because his mother and father were horses when they were conceived, then he has to be a horse. See how weird this is? It's also kind of disgusting. We'll be talking about that at the start of class on Monday of next week. The Arion's kind of weird. You thought Arion was weird. Pegasus is a horse, too, but he's a horse who can fly. You don't even want to know how he was born. He was born out of the severed neck of his mother after Perseus cut her head off. I told you didn't want to know. You just didn't want to know. But Perseus is there. Charybdis is the whirlpool, a huge whirlpool in the ocean. She sucks in all the water she can, and that's what makes the low tide, and then she spits it all back out into the ocean, and that's what makes the high tide. So you got this big, scary sea monster out in the ocean who makes the high tide and the low tide. Sucks in the water and spits it back out. Scientists tell me the moon does that. Whatever. The moon. The moon pulls water up in the air. Right. I think the scientists are at the animistic stage. Next thing you know, they're going to be talking about Moonzilla and all this kind of stuff, how she pulls up water from the earth. That's what they say anyway. Anyway, all this is pretty strange. But it's not really all that strange when you think about it. The ancient world, they look at the sea. It's huge. It's got to have lots of gods in it. It's very powerful. These gods have to be very powerful. There had to be a lot of them to give them all this power. And then if you're going to have a promiscuous god with lots of weird kids, he has to be a sea god. Because sea gods had to be promiscuous, they had to have lots of children, they had to have lots of offspring, and who's going to be the father of all these sea gods and sea monsters and sea creatures and weird things that wash up on the beach and all this kind of stuff? If you're going to believe a particular sea monster has a parent, then that parent has to be a sea god of some kind. And so it's typical of sea gods to have weird children because you have all these weird sea monsters, scary things that live in the ocean. And of course, he's one of the Olympians.